happened to the dinosaurs also happened to these amphibian groups that survived all of these different changes over the past hundreds of millions of years, and they're still with us today. Their ancestors led us to have them around today still, which is pretty cool. If you want to know more about amphibians, there's this really great website, especially for North American amphibians. It's called amphibiaweb.org, and you can type in any species. They have mostly North American, but there's some other ones as well. And one of the cool things they did for this website is they created a map of the amount of species of amphibians that exist in the world. And if you look at this, you can see that there's some patterns across here. There are a lot of amphibians around the equator, which makes sense. It's really cool, or it's moist and warm, and it's really great habitat. And the darker areas in red and in purple, those are where there's a lot of amphibian diversity. So you can see a lot of parts of Asia and South America are really high in diversity. North America has a pretty decent amount of amphibians, and where I am in Illinois, we're not terrible. And if you go farther south into the southeast United States, then there's quite a few species, and lots of them that are really unique. One of the unique ones that I like to bring up is called the patch-nosed salamander. This is the one that I was happy and really lucky enough to help discover when I was a graduate student. It's a really cool story. My good friend Bill Peterman, who's at Ohio State, was a scientist with me. We're working as graduate students, and Bill stumbled upon this animal here. This is an adult female, so she's fully grown. She has eggs in her belly, and you can see that she can curl up on a dime. So she's super small. It's a really unique species. It is found in just a really small area in the foothills of the Appalachians in Georgia. In fact, we found it on the side of a road, basically, in a ditch. So it's a really crazy find. It's a very unique species, one of the smallest in the world as far as we know. It has some really unique characteristics. It's one of the oldest salamanders in terms of its evolutionary history in the country, in the United States. So it's a really unique find and a really fun thing to find, but it's once in a lifetime. If you think about amphibians in the United States, they're really well described. This was the first new genus of tetrapods, of four-legged animals, that was found in over 60 years at the time. And now it's going further. No one's found another one since. So it's a really rare animal. The one that was found before that, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, was another salamander species. So it's really unique to find something of this magnitude, but it just shows you that these things are so overlooked for the most part, or have been for quite a long time, that even in North America, on the side of a road in Georgia, you can still find new species. So that's a pretty fun part of amphibians. When I look at why they're so cool, there's a couple things that jump into mind for me. The first, as I already talked about, they're really diverse. So there's 8,000 almost species in the world. If you go to parts of the US in the southeast, there's dozens and dozens of species of amphibians. As you get north to where I am, there's a little bit less. In South America and Central America, there's dozens and dozens of species. In Asia, so they're really diverse and unique. They have a lot of different really cool attributes. But what's also great about them is that they're super abundant. So for most species, where they exist, there's a lot of them. So that has another unique attribute that we'll talk about with respect to why they're so important to ecosystems, is that there's so many of them, including that they're diverse. When you look at that abundance, it's hard to kind of conceptualize how many there are. Most of these amphibians in the bottom left here, this is the slimy salamander. These are terrestrial salamanders, so they don't live in water at all. In fact, they lay eggs, those eggs hatch, and they live in the forest their whole life. Never go into water if they don't need to. They breathe entirely through their skin. They have no lungs. And these guys are only about the size of your finger at their largest. And if you looked at some of their abundance and how many there are in the environment, me and Bill, my friend Bill, who found that other salamander, we did a cool study on this. And we showed that if you add up all the salamanders that are in these forests, and the one that we did in Missouri, the biomass of those salamanders, how much the weight of all those salamanders is greater, more than all the birds, all the small mammals, and even all the deer. It's hard to conceptualize that. A deer is big. There's a lot of mice in the ground, but there's even more of these salamanders. There's hundreds and hundreds and thousands in the forest floor. And you don't see them oftentimes because most of the time in these cases, they only come out when it's wet and night. So these lungless ones need to breathe through their skin, so they come out when it's raining at night, so you almost never see them. They're in the leaf litter anyway, but once you start looking into how many there are, there's tons of them. And that makes them really important to ecosystems because there's so many of them, even though they're really small. What we also know is that there's a lot of diversity in what we call life history of amphibians. Some of them are fully terrestrial, like those lungless guys that I study. Some of them are what we call biphasic, and really most amphibians are biphasic. They have two different life cycles. If you look at a typical frog in the United States, you have an adult frog that lays eggs. Those eggs hatch in the water usually, and then you have a tadpole that lives in the water. It breathes water through gills. It gets its air from its gills in the water. It metamorphs then. It completes metamorphosis, turns into a little froglet or a metamorphic frog, and then it will go live on land the rest of its life. So that's a biphasic life cycle. It lives in the water and it lives in land. And we see salamanders do the same thing as well. A lot of the salamander groups, the ones that are not lungless salamanders, the ones that have lungs, will live as an adult in the forest, in our case in Illinois, or the prairies. They'll lay eggs. Those eggs hatch. You have larvae like a tadpole, although it has 4 legs right away. It has gills, breathes in the water, and then it completes metamorphosis and goes into an adult. These groups also can sometimes have this really unique attribute called paedomorphism, where the adults will lay eggs, they'll hatch, and instead of turning into a larvae with gills and then complete metamorphosis into an adult and go live on land, they complete this basically different life cycle where they stay as a larvae, they have gills, they get real big, they never go on land, and they actually can lay eggs too. They're called paedomorphs. And that's a really unique life cycle where these guys right here are oftentimes eating these smaller ones. They get real big. They say, well, I don't need to leave this environment. The water's around. I'm big. I can complete reproduction here. So they can go through that phase without ever going on land and completing metamorphosis. We also know that these species are called poikilothermic. That's another term to describe what you might think of as being cold-blooded. It really means that the environment is dictating their temperature. So poikilothermic is what all amphibians are. They're all cold-blooded or ectothermic or poikilothermic, where the outside world is impacting their temperatures. They can't create their own temperature or warmth. And then you have these ones that are terrestrial. So these are the slimy salamanders again. There's dozens of species of these lungless salamanders. That's a lot of what I study at Loyola in the Appalachian Mountains, are these groups of salamanders. This is from my work as a graduate student in Arkansas, where these animals would go into a mine shaft, actually lay eggs. And this work was presented in a BBC documentary, which is pretty neat to be in. But you can see this is a female here. And we oftentimes think of amphibians as just kind of being more like plants or like robots where they just kind of lay eggs and leave. But these groups of salamanders actually take care of their eggs. This is a female that laid the eggs, and you can see all these little eggs with salamanders in them. And then she wraps around them and not only guards the eggs, protects them from other salamanders or snakes trying to eat them, but she provides a bunch of other properties. There's antimicrobial things going on. She keeps them clean. She keeps them from getting bacterial infections, and it's all through the secretions of her skin. And she's protecting these eggs, and she'll protect them all the way until they hatch. Once they hatch, they're fully functioning little tiny salamanders that go walk around and live their life. But it's pretty cool to see something like this where there's this salamander the size of your finger, and they not only lay eggs but protect them. Pretty neat. What we also know is that these amphibians have what we call permeable skin. They got a lot of holes in their skin, and that's oftentimes how they breathe. Even the ones with lungs still can breathe through their skin. This is a wood frog here. We can find them all over, for the most part, the eastern United States, all the way up into Canada and through Alaska. And they're a really cool species because they not only are a biphasic species, a frog that lays eggs in water, but these wood frogs can breathe through their skin like a lot of other frogs. They have lungs like most other frogs. And these guys can actually freeze solid. It's a really unique adaptation that they have. They flood their blood with sugar, and that sugar encapsulates their cells and keeps them from bursting when it gets frozen. So if you go out in the wintertime, you can shift through the leaf litter and sometimes find a totally solid frozen frog. It'd be a wood frog. And then the unique thing about them is they thaw out in the spring once it gets warm, but they actually thaw out from the inside out. So even though their brain and heart stop working completely because it's frozen, they thaw out from their insides and then their outsides and limbs start thawing out. And then right away they go into the ponds and breed. So it's pretty cool adaptation here. Okay, we have our first question here is how can we support habitat for amphibians? That's a really good question. I would say there's a couple things you can do. If you're looking at doing something in your home or near your house, these amphibians like really two things. They like water, and even if you live in somewhat of a rural landscape or even an urban environment that's kind of adjacent to rural landscapes, if you have a little garden pond, amphibians can sometimes colonize those. Oftentimes, they often also need some sort of either forest or natural habitat, and that can even be piles of wood that you just left, or debris or brush or leaf litter. The more of that you keep around, the more of that habitat you provide for amphibians and also other animals. There's a lot of pollinating insects. There's a lot of other animals that would use that debris pile or leaf litter pile. And if you match that with some sort of water source, you could see and find that you might attract amphibians to your own property. So amphibians are declining, and they're declining really fast and really in a scary way. Amphibians are currently undergoing what we call a sixth mass extinction event. And if you look at this graph here, this is looking at the millions of years of time. We're right here. And then you have up to 600 million years ago. We can see throughout this time that there have been 5 events where a lot of life, and you can argue most life on Earth, has gone extinct. That's happened 5 times in the past that we know of. And this most recent period happened when the dinosaurs went extinct. That was about 75 or so million years ago. An asteroid hit the Earth and it blocked out the sun, changed the climate quite a bit. And right now what we're seeing is that we're undergoing a 6th mass extinction event for not just amphibians, but really all biodiversity on Earth. And it's caused by humans. It's a human-driven mass extinction event. We call it the Epocene. So this is something that we're really worried about. And we'll talk a bit more about it after this next question here. We have one question here. What's your favorite amphibian? This is from the AP Bio students from Southwest Georgia and Seminole County. Welcome. I did my graduate degree at University of Georgia, so I know where you all are at. And my favorite is always and forever the patchnose salamander, the one that I helped discover when I was at Georgia as a graduate student. That's not just my favorite amphibian in Georgia or the United States. It's my favorite amphibian anywhere ever. That will never change. Let's keep talking about these mass extinction events. What we know is that currently we can estimate that about 1/3, 33% of all known amphibian species are at risk of going extinct. What that means is either their populations are low enough or the habitat that they're living within is declining so fast or there's other threats that I'll talk about that are causing us to be really concerned that these species might not exist, and certainly not exist much longer. What we can do is calculate something called the background extinction rate. What that is basically a normal rate at which animals would go extinct. And this is something that we could calculate and estimate based on fossil records and past data. And what we know today is that amphibians are going extinct thousands and thousands times faster than what they should be, than what would be what you consider a normal rate of extinction. We know that at least 200 species have gone extinct in the past 50 years of just amphibians. This doesn't count the ones that we never knew existed, because remember, we're still going and finding new species every trip to the tropics, every trip to Asia that we take and look for these, we generally find some. We expect at least another 7% of frog species could be extinct in the next 100 years. So what this shows is that this decline in amphibian taxa is really worrisome. It's very fast, and it's not normal. One more question here before we move on. What color are most amphibians? That's a good question. In general, I would say that most amphibians are either some form of brown or gray or black. One of the big things they try to do is camouflage themselves. So, since you're really abundant, you don't have many defenses as an amphibian. So one of the ways they could not get eaten so much is to stay camouflaged. So most species are in that kind of brown or dark brown or black or gray kind of color phase. But as you can see, some of the pictures that I have floating around, we have really, really bright amphibian species, not just in the US, but all over the tropics. And those are ones that are either toxic, so they're trying to say, hey, I'm toxic, don't eat me, or they're trying to mimic a species that's toxic. So they're not toxic, they're just trying to act like they are, which is pretty cool too. So what I want to talk about for really the bulk of the rest of the talk here is what's causing these extinctions in amphibians. So there's 5 different main causes, I would say, and they're habitat destruction, disease, pollutants. We think climate change is going to have a pretty big impact, and then the pet trade and overexploitation. So I'll talk about each of these more specifically, but first we have another question. What type of schooling have you had to this point? Oh, that's a good point. Okay, let me backtrack and talk about my journey into being a professor and being a scientist. I actually grew up in Detroit, so I didn't grow up in nature at all. A lot of scientists that you'll talk to grew up catching frogs and salamanders or other animals or bird watching or going out in swamps and catching bugs. I didn't really have those opportunities, so I grew up in the city environment. So I didn't know anything about salamanders or frogs or science really until I went to college. And I almost didn't go to college. I had other choices. I was the first person in my family to go, so my brother and I were the first students in college in our whole family. So we're first generation students, and I was either going to go work as a roofer or go to college. And I thought I would try out college for a little while. I didn't do really good my freshman year, but in my second year of college, I stuck around, and one of the faculty members in my really small school, I went to Adrian College in Michigan, was a herpetologist. So he studied reptiles and amphibians. And it sparked my interest enough, and I saw the job that he was doing, and I thought, I think I would like to do that, be a college professor. So that's what I set my sights on. And I knew I had to go to graduate school for that. So I graduated from Adrian, and I worked really hard, took some really cool jobs across the country, doing some wildlife and herpetology surveys. And then I was able to go to Arkansas State University to get my master's degree, which is a degree right under someone becoming a PhD and getting a doctor. So I went to Arkansas State with my advisor named Stan Troth. He was amazing, changed my life. And I did well enough there that I was able to get into University of Georgia to start my PhD program. And again, I was lucky enough to go to my PhD. I did it with John Mayers at Georgia, who also changed my life, and was really lucky enough to get my job at Loyola to continue to work on amphibians. So I had a kind of uncharacteristic pathway. A lot of students would, um, you know, do this since they're growing up, and then have maybe mentorship as they went along, a little bit more closely than I did. But I kind of made up my own path and followed my interest, and it just happened to lead me to a place that I really love. So I was one of the lucky ones. But I would say you should look at it as an inspiration because being a first generation student is not easy, but it's definitely something that's gratifying when you can accomplish it. Let's get into the weeds here a little bit. Let's talk about what these different impacts are of global change and how they're impacting amphibians. And again, keep the questions coming as we go through. So the main one, and I think this follows with all wildlife really, not just amphibians and reptiles, but all wildlife, habitat loss or habitat destruction is the number one cause of species declining. There's just no way around it. Either we're converting habitat, so we're taking forest and converting them to agriculture, let's say. We're draining wetlands to build cities or suburbs. So there's a lot of these different conversions that are occurring in terms of deforestation or loss of habitat. And the loss or destruction or conversion of habitat is what's taking away that habitat for species. They really need a lot of it. When you think about it, if we could set forth to conserve about 50% of land for wildlife, then we might have a chance to kind of curb this mass extinction event. It's that important. Amphibians are also really impacted by disease. We talked about this issue of having permeable skin. And a lot of folks might say that amphibians are kind of this canary to coal mines, or so if they're really widely impacted by these environmental factors because they have permeable skin. And in some cases, that's true. But really, what we're seeing is in addition to habitat destruction, we're seeing that amphibians are getting hit by diseases. And part of this is because they have permeable skin, but we think part of it is actually because the climate's changing. One of the main ones that we're really worried about is called the chytrid fungus. You might hear it is called the BD fungus as well. This is something that Dr. Karen Lips found in the 1980s in Central America. And what Dr. Lips and her team were finding were that there are these huge die-offs of frogs and other amphibian species in this western part of Central America. And every year that die-off would get a little bit farther east. And what they identified, it was this particular fungus that we can really find everywhere. The BD fungus is found in North America all over the place, but we think it was something with the change in climate, the climate warming, that triggered it to be really toxic for these amphibian species. So it really wreaked havoc in Central America, and we're worried about it in a lot of other areas. B-Sal is another one of those fungal infections that's occurring in Europe right now, and we're hoping to restrict it to Europe. I'm not sure how well we can do with this, but it more specifically impacts salamanders, and it's another fungal infection that can cause really significant die-offs of species. And then we have some viruses too. The ranavirus is one that we find in Illinois that it impacts amphibians and reptiles, where it causes these mass die-off events as well. So we're seeing these kind of viral, bacterial, fungal things creeping up in the amphibian world, and they're really causing a lot of stress and havoc on these populations. So it's something that we're keeping an eye on. We're really trying our best to find solutions to it, but it's an uphill battle for sure. We have another question here before we move on. What type of amphibian is kept as a pet the most? That's a good question. I think the most common one I see is a tiger salamander. That's one of those salamanders that has lungs. So they usually will live in the forest as adults. They will go lay eggs in the water, and then they will complete metamorphosis or become a paedomorph, remember, where they stay as a larval and reproduce, and then they go back on land. And I think they're most popular because they're really widespread. You can find them across North America and all across Canada, or at least the southern part of Canada. So they're really widespread species. There's a lot of them. And when you find them, you usually find them in great numbers. So I think that's probably the most common one kept as a pet. I would say, and this will tie into number 5 here. If you're going to keep an animal as a pet, make sure you get it from either a credited pet shop or a dealer that breeds them in captivity, because otherwise you're taking animals from the wild, and that's something that we don't want to do. What we're also seeing is that pollutants is a big issue with amphibians. This has to do a lot with their permeable skin. So they have skin that has a lot of holes in it, so they can absorb a lot of pollutants. But it also has to deal with where they live. They live in the water. And a lot of times they live in wetlands that are draining a lot of land. So whatever's on the land around the wetlands that they live, even if it's several miles, it could travel into these areas where these frogs and salamanders are breeding in the water. And that's a really delicate stage in life. When you're an egg in a newly hatched young individual, you're really susceptible to being impacted by these pollutants. What we also see is that they can cause a bunch of different impacts. Sometimes they just kill the animal outright. Other times they can cause these deformities like lost legs or extra legs. They can change the sex of different species, so kind of skewing animals towards more females. So these pharmaceuticals, pollutants from fertilization, pollutants from trying to mitigate like invasive species, so herbicides, pesticides, they all get in the water. And what we're seeing is that those pollutants collectively are having a lot of different negative impacts on amphibian species that we're really worried about. And this is something that we can really mitigate as humans. Habitat destruction, we could really have an impact on stopping or curbing or slowing down. Pollutants, we can really have an impact on slowing down by things that we do as humans. And diseases is something that we just have to try to do our best to combat. Now, when I talk about global climate change in amphibians, what I like to say is that from what we know, it's not really significantly impacting amphibians now in terms of mass die-offs or species declining, but we're really, really worried about it in the future. And what we're seeing is that it's already changing how species act. It's changing what species do when they do it. That's called phenology. So we're seeing these phenological shifts. We're seeing where species live starting to change a little bit, their distribution. And we're worried about these kind of changes to their physiology, how they operate. My former grad student at Loyola, Brock Struker, he did this really cool study where he looked at the amphibian species in the Midwestern US. So we're right here in Illinois and Chicago. So he looked at all these surrounding states, and Brock was able to create these maps that would predict where these amphibians could live if the climate changed. So if the climate got warmer or didn't get as warm as we're predicting, Brock was able to predict where these amphibians could live based on their heat tolerance or their ability to survive in these different temperatures. So what Brock saw is that even with just a little bit of change, these blue areas are where there's a lot less amphibian species than there are today. The red areas are where there's either the same amount or even a little bit more. So what Brock's showed is that with just a little bit of change, you can have this big change in where the environment is suitable for amphibians. It's just going to be too warm for a lot of species in large regions of the Midwest. With more change, stronger warming, more strength in warming, more extremes in warming, what Brock showed is that intensified this impact. So a lot more species and a lot more area might be unsuitable for species in the future. So this is something that we're really concerned about globally, is whether amphibians have that ability to combat climate change. And it's not even combating it, it's can they deal with the change? We're concerned about it. We're not sure that their physiology can handle it. It's a very fast climatic change, and they have very small windows oftentimes of what type of temperatures they can live in. We have a few other questions here. So the first one is, the salamanders are so hard to find. Do you have any special tricks to locating them? They know they must have them in the area because there's frogs and toads. Are they there year round, and how I find them? Okay, it's a good question. I would say there's a couple good ways to do it. With any amphibian, frog, toad, or salamander, most of them need water. So if there are any forest preserves or public lands that have wetlands or these kind of smaller water bodies, I would say that might dry up sometimes. If you go there in the spring or even the fall, you could see a lot of amphibians traveling to those areas to breed, so you can catch the adults. Sometimes you can take some dip nets into the water and look for the larvae. And other times you can just look under logs, look at the leaves of the ground, and you could rustle up some amphibians, especially after it rains. What I will say is, though, we're really, really worried about amphibian diseases. And a lot of times humans can carry those diseases. So if you're looking at one site for amphibians, I would make sure you have permission to do that at the site, especially if it's a public land like a forest preserve. But then I would also say, if you're going to move to another site, you should clean your shoes, dip nets, whatever you have that you used. What eats salamanders? That's the next question here. Basically everything. Turkeys, other birds, snakes, sometimes humans, virtually everything eats salamanders. Do all amphibians have webbed feet? No, they don't, actually. Most actually don't. Most frogs don't have webbed feet. Most of the time, the frogs or other amphibians that have webbed feet live in the water, are aquatic, and even a lot of those don't have webbed feet. Most of the lungless salamanders, if not all of them, don't have webbed feet at all. So it's kind of a misconception that they do, but because I would say almost most of them don't. Okay, another reason that these species are declining, I'm going to lump it into one thing: the pet trade and overexploitation. What we've seen recently, especially in Asia, is that there's a lot of amphibian species that are getting collected for food or for trade in the pet trade, and it's way more than we can sustain. These populations can't really sustain that many being taken from the wild. What we've also seen is that even in the United States, there's animals that are collected from the wild, and then they're put in the pet trade. And there's a lot of those that occur, and that's not something that's sustainable either. It's not just taking the animals from the wild, but it's removing them so they can't reproduce and they're ecologically dead. But it's a big transfer of disease. So you're taking animals from the wild, they're coming into these private collections or back and forth into the wild from private collections, and it's a big transmitter of disease. It's a big worry that we have. So it's one of the main reasons that these species are in decline, is that they're getting taken from the wild too much, either for food or for trade. Okay, so what does this mean? I just talked about amphibians and how cool they are. So we don't want to lose them because they're cool. That would suck, right? Losing species, having them go extinct just because they exist sucks. But we also have to remember that these things are incredibly diverse, they're super abundant, and they are food for a lot of things. So if you just looked at this from the perspective of an ecologist, we should be concerned that these things are declining, that these species are declining, because a lot of animals above them in the food web are relying on them. They're full of protein, they're not very fast, and there's a lot of them. So they're a huge food source of protein and nutrients for other organisms. So much so that I would be concerned if we lost a lot of amphibian species, we might see a lot of other wildlife populations declining pretty fast. What my research has shown at Loyola is that these species are also important for what we call ecosystem functions. These are ways that the environment operates. And one of the ways I started looking at was amphibians in terms of how they recycle nutrients in the environment. So we just looked at this little salamander here. This salamander might eat bugs. All these salamanders eat bugs. They don't eat plants at all. Those bugs have different levels of phosphorus. This salamander needs phosphorus. It has bones, it has DNA, it needs that nutrient of phosphorus. So it's going to eat that bug. It's going to use whatever phosphorus it needs to grow and to maintain its bone structure, to replenish its cells, to reproduce, whatever it does. And then it excretes the rest. So the salamander is eating a bug, which is organic. And if that bug died, that organic bug couldn't be uptaken by plants. The plants couldn't use that phosphorus of that bug. It would have to be converted. Salamanders are converting it. They're eating the bug, they're going to the bathroom, and when they go to the bathroom, they're excreting phosphorus that's inorganic, phosphorus that plants can use. So even though they're small, there's so many of them, millions and millions in the right area, that they are taking this bug and transferring it to something that plants can use, and that's nutrient cycling. So my lab studies salamander poop, and it's pretty cool because they are really important to ecosystems in terms of converting these nutrients, making it available for plants. And you can imagine that that's a really cool ecosystem function, but it's also ecosystem service, I would argue. It helps humans, having environments that are healthy. We have a couple more questions here. Here's a question from Facebook here. Could students or teachers come visit your lab? Yeah, I would say that's a possibility. My lab doesn't do a lot of outreach, but there are other labs that do in the Chicago area. If you're around, the Any Nature Museum would have outreach events for students that are really good. The Field Museum, the Peggy Notabart Nature Museum in Chicago. So if you found a local nature center, if you weren't close to Chicago, then I would say that's your best bet of having student and teachers and classes kind of interacting with each other. I don't keep a lot of live animals in my lab, but I do a lot of research out in the wild, in the field. So there's opportunities where students and teachers can meet me in the field, and I can show them what we do, for sure. Okay, another one here. How much time do I work in carrying out investigations? What do I do? That's a good question. I would say, if I'm not teaching and it's during the time period where my animals move. So in Illinois, almost everything shuts down in the winter. So a lot of the time that I spend where I'm conducting my research, it's out in the wild. So I would say from April until September or October, I'm probably on a good year out in the wild 1 to 2 weeks a year, or 1 to 2 weeks a month, I mean. So quite a bit of time I'm doing something, or my students are doing something that is collecting data on wild animals outside. And then I would say the other part of my job is writing up that data. We're as scientists, we publish our data, and that's how knowledge gets built in the sciences. So a lot of what my research is writing about what we find in our data collection during the spring and summer, and what my students find. We all kind of collaboratively write that together so other scientists can learn from it as well. So actually on the ground catching stuff is a couple months out of the year is I do it pretty regular, and the rest of the time I usually write about or teach about different cool things that we find. Okay, here's another question. Do we know about how many salamanders die a year? That's a good question. I don't think we know that number exactly. We know that salamanders live a long time. Some of them can live 20 or plus years. Frogs are a lot less, but there's constant population turnover, where the older ones are dying and the newer ones are coming in. But if we talk about how many die from, those 5 different causes, it's millions, easily. Okay, another question. Can I come to Elsden High School and help you to find some salamanders? Yeah, I would love to try that. Put me in touch. Okay, do amphibians eat other amphibians? Yes, definitely. There are some frog species that only eat other frogs in the tropics. There are salamanders that I study that eat a lot of other salamanders. Most don't. Most just eat bugs. So yes, there are absolutely amphibians that eat other amphibians, even the same species. Let's continue about why they're important to save these animals. What we also found, and this is the last point I'll make here, is that when we look at amphibians as a whole, we could try to save them because it's the right thing to do. We don't want them to go extinct. We could try to save them because we think they're important, or we know they're important for the environment. But if you talk about humans directly, there's a lot of medical advancements that have come from studying amphibians. So there's compounds in poison dart frogs that are used for cancer research. A lot of amphibians, a lot of salamanders in particular, can regenerate limbs, arms, legs, tails. They grow them back. That's something that we would love for humans to be able to do in some capacity. So trying to study how that works is something that could lead to a lot of medical advancements as well. But none of this will happen if these species are lost, if they're gone from Earth. Every species that goes extinct before we know about it, we might lose something really incredible in terms of a medical advancement. So that's another reason I think we should really focus on conserving these animals. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. I would love to answer any questions that you all have. Okay, here's another one. Do toads cause warts? And are they poisonous to dogs? Those are good questions. As far as I know, and I'm not a medical professional, I do not think toads cause warts. I will say, yes, they are. Your dog should not eat them. They do have not a toxin per se, maybe a toxin, kind of a poisonous secretion that that it could have that would taste pretty bitter to your dog. But I don't think they cause warts. Okay, are all amphibians carnivores? No. I would say a lot of them are. All the lungless salamanders that I study are carnivorous. And if you looked at the salamanders that live in ponds in and around Illinois that are those biphasic ones that live in the land and water, they're carnivorous. But a lot of frogs in the larval stage, as they're babies, actually eat plants. and then when the frogs metamorph and turn into frogs on in the land, they become carnivorous. So it's kind of a mix. A lot of the tropical species of frogs are carnivores when they're larvae as well. So they don't um, they don't eat bugs or anything until they're on land. So I would say it's kind of a mix. When they're babies, for the most part, the frogs are carnivorous. Most salamanders are carnivorous. Most frogs are carnivorous when they're adults, and when they're babies, they're herbivores. They eat plants usually. Okay, we have a question here. How can we help? There's a couple ways you could do things at your home that help support amphibians where they can live. You could educate your family about how cool amphibians are and how much trouble they're in. And when you're old enough, you can vote for people that actually care about the environment. That's another big thing, is that we could do so much as citizens, but if you vote for folks that are making laws and implementing policies that help animals, that really helps a whole lot as well. Okay, another couple questions. What's my favorite amphibian? I would say the patch-nosed salamander, the one that I helped find, is by far my favorite one. Where's the best place in Illinois to find salamanders? I would say the very southern tip, where Illinois meets, Missouri and Kentucky, down at the bottom there. If you went to the Shawnee National Forest, that's the best place to find amphibians in Illinois by far. If you're looking around Chicago, I would say the closer you get to Wisconsin, or the farther west you get of the city, the better. Okay. So Marie asked, "What's the best amphibian to have as a pet?" I would say the ones that are most easy to take care of, that live the longest, are uh, the tiger salamanders that you can get from an accredited pet shop that breeds them in captivity. So you're not taking them from the wild. Those are probably the best. They're easy to take care of. They live a fairly long time, but they don't move around a lot. How can amphibians live both on land and in the water? And how do they find water to lay eggs? Those are good questions. So you have to remember, when they live on land and water, there's a kind of a gradient there. So some animals, some species might live completely on land, like the wood frog, when they're adults. They'll lay eggs in water. When those eggs hatch, those babies have gills, so they can live in the water and be just fine. Then they complete metamorphosis. They lose their gills, they gain lungs, and they go on land. So that's a pretty typical life cycle. Some frogs live in water a lot. Some frogs live in water as babies and adults. And they can do that by gulping air, still breathing air, sticking close to the surface when they have lungs, or as babies, they have gills. So they have these ways that they developed to breathe air, whether they live in the water completely or whether they live partially on land. How do they find the water to lay eggs? That's a good question. I think they use a bunch of different cues, as far as I can tell, or as far as we know. It's not studied hugely, but they do have what's called natal site fidelity. So a lot of times, the salamanders or frogs that hatch out in a particular pond or a wetland, they will leave that when they grow up, and they'll disperse, but they'll come back to that spot to lay eggs. So it doesn't always happen, but it happens a lot. So what we think is they're using a lot of different orientation tools. This is happening at night, so it could be celestial cues. It could be some sort of compass orientation that they have with, like, the gravitational pull of the Earth or magnetic fields. I don't know if we quite know how, um, but they definitely do it. It could be scent trails. Okay. What month is the best for looking for salamanders in northern Illinois? I would say probably April. May is really good as well. If you really wanted to get a big pulse of them, you could go in March, and it seems counterintuitive. The snow can still be melting, and if it's rainy and I would say above 40 degrees, then the salamanders will emerge and start walking to their ponds. So if you miss that, that's only about a week a year that happens. If you miss that, then April and May are good to still find them on the surface a bit. Do most amphibians protect their eggs and young? No, most don't. The only ones that we know of do consistently are lungless salamanders and the caecilians, those kind of worm-like, really rare organisms that live in the tropics. They protect their eggs and young, and a couple frog species, but most don't. Okay, frogs and toads make awls. Do salamanders? I'm not sure I understand that one, but I would say that frogs and toads are made up of a bunch of different families, and those are all different than salamanders, so they're very distinct groups. Okay, do salamanders make calls? The answer is no. They don't make calls per se to attract mates, but I did publish a paper where a salamander was making chirping noises at me, which is pretty cool. There's actually several different ones over the course of several months, so wasn't really a call, but they were definitely making a noise. Do axolotls retain their gills as adults? They do. Yeah, they're one of those salamanders that are live in the water all the time, so they're paedomorphic. They never lose their gills. We have about 4 minutes if there's any other questions.
So that seems like the ending for questions. Me and Arun had a few questions. So from here, we want to ask, are bullfrogs non-native? And do they cause problems like cane toads?
Are wood frogs non-native?
Bullfrogs.
Bullfrogs. Bullfrogs are native in the eastern half of the United States. So if you look at the Mississippi River as a cutoff, on the east side of the Mississippi River, bullfrogs are native. On the west side, they're not. And they cause a lot of issues. Yes.
How does it feel to discover one of the smallest salamanders in the world?
It feels pretty unreal, to be honest. It's a total luck find. We put ourselves in a position that a lot of other scientists would have done. And lucky for Bill, he was aware enough to keep that animal and to find it, the size of a dime in the forest. So it feels pretty cool. It's a really unique find, and it's just neat to be a part of it.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Milanovich, for that lovely presentation, and thank you for taking the time out of your day. And I hope you have a great day. So,
Thank you all. Nice seeing you.
Thank you.